Fluorescent tubes hummed a dead synthetic pitch against the concrete ceiling. David just wanted out. He smelled like sawdust and cheap coffee, clutching a paper receipt that meant nothing to the man blocking the sliding glass doors. A hand clamped down on his shoulder. "Not so fast, buddy." Tuesday evenings at the big box hardware store carried a specific, depressing atmosphere. The air was thick with the contradictory smells of synthetic floral perfumes from the garden center, raw chemical fertilizers, and the stale grease radiating from the hot dog stand near the entrance. David pushed his cart over the cracked linoleum, the front right wheel stuck in a perpetual, agonizing stutter. Clack-scrape, clack-scrape. His eyes burned. He had spent the last 11 hours staring at dual monitors in a windowless federal building downtown, tracing phantom wire transfers through shell corporations based in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. His brain felt like bruised fruit. He was 38. His lower back harbored a dull, constant ache, and all he wanted was to install a new deadbolt on his front door and eat the leftover pad thai sitting in his fridge. In his cart sat a heavy-duty rotary hammer drill in a bright yellow cardboard box, a pack of elongated brass screws, and a tube of industrial cork. He had navigated the self-checkout lanes with the tired efficiency of a man who just wanted to be invisible. The scanner had chirped its hollow electronic approval. He had swiped his card. He had taken the curled, slick-backed thermal receipt. Now he was 50 feet from the humid, exhaust-choked night air of the parking lot. Just before the sliding glass doors, the bottleneck formed. A small folding table sat in the center of the exit path, manned by an elderly woman in a blue vest who looked equally as exhausted as David. Beside her, leaning against a pallet of rock salt with aggressive casualness, was a uniformed police officer working a private security gig. David didn't stop to analyze the man. He didn't want to. But 40 years of living in his own skin, coupled with 15 years in law enforcement, made the assessment automatic. The officer was thick around the middle, his duty belt squeaking faintly as he shifted his weight. The silver nameplate pinned to his chest read Stanton. He was aggressively chewing a piece of gum, his jaw working in a rhythmic, mechanical grind. Stanton's eyes tracked the departing customers with a lazy arrogance. Two contractors in paint-spattered jeans pushed a flatbed loaded with lumber past the doors without a second glance. A soccer mom with a cart full of terracotta pots and potting soil breezed by, offering the elderly receipt checker a tight, dismissive smile. David approached the gap. He held his receipt out, a white flag of consumer compliance. The elderly woman reached for it, her frail hand shaking slightly, but before her fingers could brush the thermal paper, Stanton pushed himself off the pallet. He moved with a sudden jarring heaviness, stepping squarely into the center of the exit lane. He blocked the automatic doors. They hissed closed behind him, trapping David in the harsh, glaring lights of the vestibule. "Hold up," Stanton said. The air around the cop smelled of spearmint, gum, cheap aerosol deodorant, and the metallic tang of brass polish. David stopped. The stuck wheel of his cart gave one final dying scrape. He didn't feel a sudden surge of heroic defiance. He didn't feel righteous anger. What he felt was a crushing, suffocating wave of fatigue. It was the deep, sour exhaustion of a script he had been forced to memorize since he was old enough to walk to a corner store alone. "I need to see the receipt," Stanton said. His voice wasn't asking. It was a flat, practiced demand. "I just held it out," David replied. His voice was low, devoid of inflection. He extended his right hand again, pinching the flimsy paper between his thumb and index finger. Stanton didn't take it immediately. Instead, he let his pale blue eyes travel slowly from the scuffed toes of David's boots, up the dark denim of his jeans, to the oversized, nondescript black windbreaker draped over his shoulders. David knew exactly what Stanton saw. He saw a tall black man in casual, baggy clothing pushing a $300 power tool toward the exit. Stanton finally snatched the paper from David's hand. He didn't look at the printed text. Not really. His eyes flicked to the yellow box in the cart, then back to David's chest. "Self-checkout, huh?" Stanton asked, his jaw snapping the gum. "Yes. Seems to be a lot of mistakes over at the self-checkout lately," Stanton drawled. He unfolded the receipt, making a theatrical show of running his thick, blunt index finger down the printed lines. People scanning a pack of gum and dropping a power drill in the bag. Accidents, you know. David's jaw tightened. A sharp, localized pain bloomed behind his right temple. He could hear the low hum of the fluorescent lights above them, a maddening insect buzz. "The drill is on the third line," David said, forcing his voice to remain utterly flat. "It's clearly itemized, along with the screws and the cork. $289 plus tax." Stanton stopped chewing his gum for a fraction of a second. He actually looked at the receipt this time. David watched the cop's eyes track the line item, saw the briefest flicker of hesitation as the printed reality contradicted his predetermined narrative. But Stanton was a man wearing a badge and a gun in a room full of civilians. Retreat wasn't in his tactical manual. Admitting an error was akin to weakness. "Code doesn't match," Stanton lied smoothly. He crushed the receipt in his fist. "I'm going to need you to step to the side, sir. We're going to verify this merchandise." David stared at the balled-up piece of paper in the cop's hand. The absurdity of it tasted metallic on his tongue. He was an accountant with a badge. He dismantled international money laundering rings for the federal government. He held a TS/SCI security clearance. And right now he was being treated like a petty thief over a DeWalt hammer drill by a man who likely couldn't balance a checkbook. "No," David said. The single syllable dropped into the space between them like a lead weight. Stanton's posture instantly changed. The lazy-leaning security guard vanished, replaced by a tense, aggressive patrolman. He widened his stance, dropping his hands to rest just above his duty belt. His thumb brushed the leather holster of his taser. "Excuse me." Stanton's voice dropped an octave, scraping the bottom of his throat. "Did you just say no to me?" Bystanders were beginning to notice. A woman pushing a cart full of light bulbs stopped 10 feet away, her eyes widening. She subtly pulled her cart backward, retreating from the invisible blast radius of the confrontation. The elderly receipt checker took 2 hurried steps away from the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. "I said no," David repeated. He didn't raise his voice. He kept his hands resting lightly on the plastic handle of his shopping cart. The coarse, textured plastic dug into the calluses on his palms. "I paid for the items. You looked at the receipt. You saw the itemization. I am leaving now." "You're not going a damn anywhere," Stanton barked. The spearmint smell was suddenly overwhelmed by the sour scent of the cop's own spiking adrenaline. "You are suspected of retail theft. You are lawfully detained. Show me your ID, right now." David felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't fear of the law, it was fear of the mechanics of the situation. Underneath his oversized black windbreaker, resting securely on his right hip in a Kydex holster, was a Glock 19. It was his agency-issued duty weapon. Tucked into his back left pocket was a leather bifold wallet. Inside that wallet wasn't just a driver's license, but a solid gold shield identifying him as a special agent with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Protocol dictated he identify himself immediately to local law enforcement to de-escalate. But reality, the ugly, undeniable reality of standing in a brightly lit vestibule as a black man, facing an angry, humiliated white cop, screamed at him to freeze. If he reached behind his back for his wallet, Stanton would see the movement. If the windbreaker shifted and Stanton saw the black grip of the Glock, Stanton would draw his own weapon. And cops like Stanton didn't draw their weapons to ask questions. David's mind raced through the tactical geometry of the next 5 seconds. His breathing slowed. He maintained absolute stillness, hyper-aware of the placement of his hands. "Officer Stanton," David said, deliberately reading the nameplate, keeping his tone measured and non-threatening. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not refusing to identify myself, but I need to explain how we are going to do this. You don't dictate terms to me." Stanton stepped forward, completely closing the distance. He was entirely in David's personal space now. David could see the burst capillaries on the cop's nose, the fine sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "ID now, or you're going in cuffs." "My wallet is in my back left pocket," David said, speaking slowly, projecting his voice just enough so the bystanders could hear him. A digital record for the invisible audience. "I am not reaching for it, because I am legally carrying a concealed firearm on my right hip." Stanton froze. For a terrifying second, David saw the cop's eyes blow wide with raw panic. Stanton's right hand flew off his belt, his palm slapping down on the grip of his own holstered sidearm. He didn't draw, but the heavy leather creaked loudly in the sudden quiet of the vestibule. "Don't you move a fucking muscle!" Stanton yelled, his voice cracking. "Keep your hands on the cart. Do not move." "My hands are on the cart," David said softly. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, caged bird. The utter absurdity of the situation warred with the very real possibility of catching a hollow-point bullet in the chest over a home improvement project. "I am perfectly still. I am an armed federal officer. My credentials are in the wallet in my left pocket." Stanton's breathing was ragged. He was visibly vibrating, caught in the adrenaline dump of a perceived lethal threat. The rational part of Stanton's brain was struggling against his ego and his fear. "Bullshit!" Stanton spat, though his voice wavered. "You're a Fed." "Yeah, right. Turn around. Turn around. Slowly put your hands behind your back." David closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The deep, burning humiliation settled over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He was a GS-13 investigator. He routinely sat across interrogation tables from cartel accountants and corrupt politicians. He had earned his badge through grueling months at the federal law enforcement training centers. And none of it mattered. In this fluorescent-lit purgatory, he was nothing more than the threat Stanton had decided he was. With agonizing slowness, David released the plastic handle of the cart. He raised his hands to shoulder-height palms open and facing forward. The air in the vestibule felt thick, unbreathable. "I am turning around," David announced to the silent, watching audience. He pivoted on his heel, turning his back to the terrified, aggressive man behind him. He felt Stanton's heavy, sweaty hand clamp down violently on his left wrist, wrenching it backward. The nylon of David's windbreaker bunched uncomfortably. The pinch of Stanton's thick fingers digging into his joint sent a sharp flare of pain up his arm. David's muscles instinctively tightened, the combat training buried in his muscle memory, urging him to break the hold, to drop his center of gravity and throw the heavier man over his hip. But he violently suppressed the urge. He let his arm go limp, offering zero resistance, submitting to the degrading theater of his own arrest. "Left pocket," David said quietly to the linoleum floor as the cold steel of a handcuff bit into his wrist. "Read the gold badge, Stanton, and then figure out how you're going to explain this." Cold steel bit into David's right wrist. The ratcheting mechanism of the Smith & Wesson handcuffs snapped with a loud metallic clack, clack, clack. It was a sound David had heard 1,000 times, usually from the other side of the equation. Hearing it apply to his own flesh sent a visceral, sickening jolt straight down to his stomach. Stanton's breathing was a wet, ragged rasp, right by David's ear. The cop was operating entirely on a toxic cocktail of fear and unchecked authority. He yanked David's right arm back, forcing it to meet the left. David's shoulder screamed in protest. The angle was unnatural, his heavy winter coat binding his arms tight. Another sharp bite of metal, another rapid series of clicks. He was restrained. Leg spread. Stanton barked, his voice echoing off the high glass windows of the vestibule. He kicked the inside of David's right ankle with the hard toe of his boot, forcing his stance wide. David stared straight ahead at the automatic doors. Through the glass, the dark expanse of the parking lot stretched out, dotted with sodium vapor lamps, casting a sickly orange glow. He focused on a single flickering bulb near a silver sedan. He had to compartmentalize. If he let the humiliation fully wash over him right now, he would react. And if he reacted, Stanton would shoot him. It was a statistical probability David couldn't ignore. Stanton's hands were rough, patting down David's sides with frantic, jerky motions. When the cop's hand hit the solid mass of the Glock 19, resting in the Kydex holster on David's right hip, Stanton let out a sharp hiss, jumping back a half step, as if the gun had burned him. "Weapon!" Stanton yelled, though there was no other law enforcement around to hear him. It was pure theater for the civilian audience. "I got a weapon on him. I told you I was armed," David said to the glass doors. His voice was a flat, deadened monotone. "I told you exactly where it was. Shut your mouth." Stanton stepped back in. He reached under the hem of David's windbreaker, his fingers fumbling clumsily with the retention hood of the holster. The cop was shaking. David could feel the tremor vibrating through the fabric of his jacket. Stanton finally wrenched the Glock free. He didn't clear the chamber. He didn't lock the slide back. He just shoved the loaded pistol awkwardly into his own back pocket, a massive breach of basic firearm safety. Left pocket. David repeated his eyes, never leaving the flickering orange light outside. The wallet. Stanton moved to David's left side. His thick fingers dug aggressively into the denim of David's back pocket, pulling out the worn leather bifold. The vestibule was dead silent now, save for the low, continuous hum of the overhead lights and the distant tinny sound of a pop song playing from the store's PA system. A crowd had formed a loose semicircle about 15 feet away. David could feel their eyes. He didn't need to look at them to know what they were seeing. They saw the end result of a narrative they consumed every day. A black man in baggy clothes face, pressed toward the glass hands, shackled behind his back. A cop standing over him with a confiscated gun. It didn't matter that David had spent his morning tracing $50 million in illicit fentanyl profits through a maze of offshore trusts. It didn't matter that he had a master's degree in forensic accounting. In this specific geographic coordinate, under these synthetic lights, he was the suspect, the criminal, the threat. The profound, crushing weight of that reality settled into David's bones. It tasted like ash. Behind him, David heard the soft flip of the leather wallet opening. He waited for the gasp. He waited for the sudden drop in Stanton's aggressive posture. He waited for the stammering apology. Instead, there was only a tense, agonizing silence. Stanton stared at the gold shield pinned to the inside of the leather flap. Special Agent, Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation. Beside it, the rigid plastic of David's federal credential stared back, bearing his photo, his signature and the imposing seal of the Department of the Treasury. Cognitive dissonance is a violent thing. When a human brain is presented with irrefutable evidence that shatters a deeply held ego-driven narrative, it rarely surrenders gracefully. It fights. It denies. Stanton's brain couldn't process the gold shield, or rather his ego wouldn't allow it. Admitting he had just illegally disarmed, assaulted and handcuffed a federal agent in front of a dozen witnesses meant the end of his career, a potential civil rights lawsuit, and probable federal charges. So Stanton doubled down. "Fake," Stanton breathed. The word was quiet, almost a whisper to himself, but David heard it. "Excuse me," David asked, turning his head, just enough to catch a glimpse of the cop in his peripheral vision. "I said it's fake," Stanton said, his voice gaining a desperate, brittle volume. He snapped the wallet shut. "You buy this online? Huh. Think you can flash a fake tin to get out of boosting a drill?" David closed his eyes. The sheer stupidity of the situation transcended anger. It was entering the realm of the surreal. "Stanton," David said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "Look at the holographic watermark on the ID card. Look at the microprinting on the border. Call local dispatch. Have them run my name through NCIC. Have them contact the field office. Do not do this to yourself." "Move!" Stanton growled. He grabbed David by the bicep, his fingers digging into the muscle. "We're going to the security office. You can tell your fairy tales to the loss prevention manager while we wait for a real patrol unit to come haul your ass to county." Stanton shoved David forward. Caught off guard, David stumbled, his heavy boots scuffing violently against the cracked linoleum. Because his hands were bound behind his back, he couldn't use his arms for balance. He swayed heavily, his shoulder nearly slamming into the edge of the sliding glass doors. He caught his footing at the last second, his core muscles straining. "Keep walking!" Stanton pushed him again. David walked. He was paraded back through the store, past the bottleneck, past the elderly receipt checker, who was now trembling with her hand over her mouth. They walked past the garden center, the heavy scent of synthetic lavender, now nauseatingly sweet. Every face they passed was a blur of wide eyes and hushed whispers. David kept his chin level, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. He memorized the pain in his wrists. He memorized the smell of Stanton's sweat. He memorized every single second. He was an investigator. He built cases for a living, and Officer Stanton was handing him a masterpiece. The loss prevention office was located down a narrow cinder block hallway behind the customer service desk. It smelled intensely of burnt popcorn ozone from overheating computer towers and the stale, damp odor of old carpet. Stanton practically threw David through the open doorway. David caught himself against a cheap laminate desk with his hip, the impact sending a dull ache radiating down his thigh. The room was cramped, dominated by a wall of small, square monitors, displaying grainy black and white feeds from the store's camera network. A young kid in a polo shirt, barely out of his teens with severe acne and a terrified expression, jumped out of an office chair as they entered. "Out, Gary." Stanton barked, his chest heaving. Gary didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled past them, flattening his back against the doorframe to avoid touching David, and practically sprinted down the hallway. Stanton slammed the heavy fire door shut. The loud metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed in the small room. The atmosphere instantly changed. Out in the vestibule, it was a public humiliation. In here, locked in a windowless room with an armed, panicking man, it was a lethal threat. The fluorescent light in here was worse, a sickly, pulsating green hue that cast deep shadows under Stanton's eyes. Stanton paced the length of the tiny room, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, breathing heavily through his nose. He looked cornered, David remained standing by the desk. He didn't speak. He let the silence stretch heavy and suffocating. In interrogations, silence was a weapon. Amateurs couldn't handle it. They filled the void with words, with excuses, with lies that could be dismantled later. "Sit!" Stanton pointed a trembling finger at a folding metal chair. "I prefer to stand," David replied calmly. "I said sit down," Stanton yelled, stepping into David's space, the spearmint gum smell now completely replaced by the sour reek of pure fear sweat. David looked down at the shorter man. He didn't blink. He just stared into Stanton's pale blue eyes, letting the sheer weight of his own composure press down on the cop. Slowly, deliberately, David lowered himself onto the cold metal chair. It creaked under his weight. Stanton backed away, pulling David's wallet from his pocket. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He flipped it open under the harsh light of a desk lamp. For a long minute, the only sound in the room was the whir of the computer cooling fans. Stanton stared at the badge. He stared at the ID. He tilted the plastic card, watching the holographic treasury seal shift and shimmer in the light. It wasn't a cheap prop. The weight of the metal, the crispness of the engraving, the micro-printing. It was undeniably, terrifyingly real. David watched the exact moment reality shattered Stanton's delusion. The color physically drained from Stanton's face. His flushed red cheeks turned a sickly mottled gray. His mouth parted slightly, his jaw going slack. The aggressive, chest-puffed posture evaporated, leaving behind a deflated, terrified, middle-aged man in a security uniform. Stanton looked up from the wallet to David. His eyes were wide, pleading, searching for a lifeline that didn't exist. "You." Stanton swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the quiet room. "You really are a federal agent." David finished for him, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Yes, I told you that in the vestibule. Before you decided to unholster your weapon assault, disarm me without clearing the chamber, and parade me through a retail store in handcuffs." "I didn't unholster my weapon," Stanton stammered, the lie falling out of his mouth on pure reflex. "You unclipped your retention strap and placed your hand on your grip in response to a concealed carry notification." David corrected his tone analytical, like he was dictating a report. "That is brandishing, under color of law, violation of Title 18, Section 242, deprivation of rights." Stanton swayed slightly. He reached behind him, blindly feeling for the edge of the laminate desk, and leaned against it for support. "You fit a profile." Stanton tried, his voice barely a whisper. He was drowning, grasping at water. "We've had guys hitting the power tools all week. Sweat's big jackets. You were pushing the cart fast. The self-checkout receipt didn't look right." "The receipt," David said, his voice dropping to a glacial chill, "was perfectly legible. You ignored the third line item because you had already made your decision the moment you saw me walking toward the door. You didn't see a customer. You saw a target." David shifted his weight in the uncomfortable metal chair. The steel cuffs dug deeper into his wrist bones. "Take them off," David said. Stanton looked at him, blankly paralyzed. "The cuffs, Stanton. Take them off. Now." Stanton fumbled at his duty belt. His fingers were numb, clumsy. He pulled a small silver handcuff key from a hidden pocket. He stepped behind David, his hands shaking so violently he missed the keyhole on the first 2 attempts. When the metal finally clicked open, David brought his arms forward. His shoulders burned with a deep lactic acid fire. His wrists were ringed with deep, angry red indentations. He rubbed them slowly, his eyes never leaving Stanton. "Give me my weapon," David demanded. Stanton hesitated. handing a loaded gun back to a man he had just wrongfully arrested, went against every instinct in his body. "Stanton," David said, his voice echoing off the cinder-block walls, "you have a loaded Glock 19 sitting unsecured in your back pocket. Give it to me. Now." Slowly, carefully, Stanton reached behind him. He pulled the pistol out by the slide, holding it out toward David as if it were a live grenade. David took it. He fluidly checked the chamber, verifying the round was still seated, then slid it back into his Kydex holster, snapping the retention hood in place. He stood up. He was taller than Stanton by 3 inches, and in the claustrophobic confines of the office he used every bit of that height. "Here is what is going to happen next," David said. Stanton swallowed, shrinking back against the desk. "Look, man, Agent, we can just call this a misunderstanding. Right heat of the moment. I was just doing my job." "You were doing your job." David's laugh was a short, sharp bark, utterly devoid of humor. "Your job is to check receipts. My job is to put people in federal prison." David took one step forward, closing the distance. "And Stanton, I am very, very good at my job." Sweat dripped from Stanton's chin, splattering silently onto the scuffed laminate floor. The tiny windowless loss prevention office felt like a pressurized submarine. The air handler above them rattled, pushing a lukewarm breeze across David's face. He let his right hand fall away from the grip of his holstered weapon, intentionally breaking the physical tension, but his eyes never left the patrolman. David was intimately familiar with the physiology of a ruined man. He had sat across from hedge fund managers who had just realized their offshore accounts were frozen, and cartel logistics chiefs who understood the wiretap transcripts meant 20 years in Florence ADX. The physical collapse was always the same. Shoulders caved, breath grew shallow. The eyes darted frantically, looking for an exit in a room with only one door. Stanton was currently disintegrating. He leaned heavily against the desk, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge. "I'm going to reach into my right pocket." David announced, the cadence of his voice deliberate, procedural. "I am retrieving my phone." Stanton just nodded, a jerky, puppet-like motion. He didn't speak. He couldn't. David pulled out his agency-issued smartphone. The screen was cracked in the bottom left corner, a reminder of a raid in Albuquerque 3 months prior. He unlocked it with his thumb, pulling up a blank note file. His own thumb was trembling. Just a fraction of a millimeter, a microscopic vibration born from the massive dump of cortisol and adrenaline flushing through his bloodstream. His wrists throbbed with a dull, hot ache where the steel had bitten into bone. He was so incredibly tired. "Let's do an accounting officer, Stanton," David said, his fingers hovering over the digital keyboard. "Because right now you are standing on the edge of a precipice, and you need to understand the exact depth of the fall." Stanton swallowed hard. "Agent, please. I got a wife. I got 2 girls in middle school. Don't blow this up. It was a bad call. I admit it. A bad call." David looked up from the screen. The raw, desperate plea hung in the stale air. A part of David, the human part that knew the crushing weight of a ruined career, felt a microscopic twinge of empathy. But then, the phantom cold of the handcuffs flared around his wrists. He remembered the old woman's terrified eyes in the vestibule. He remembered the feeling of being turned around, publicly displayed as a criminal, solely because of the color of his skin and the clothes on his back. If he hadn't possessed that gold shield, what would have happened? He would be in the back of a cruiser right now. His face would be in a mugshot database. He would be spending thousands on a defense attorney to prove he paid for a drill. "A bad call is misreading a license plate," David said smoothly. His voice was a flat, unyielding surface. What you did was a targeted deprivation of rights under color of law. That is Title 18, United States Code, Section 242. It is a federal felony. Stanton flinched as if physically struck. David began to type, narrating as he tapped the glass screen. You initiated an investigative stop without reasonable articulable suspicion. You escalated to a custodial arrest without probable cause. You committed battery when you wrenched my shoulder. You committed armed robbery when you illegally confiscated my personal property, my firearm. And you committed false imprisonment when you locked me in this room. I thought you were stealing. Stanton's voice cracked, rising in a sudden desperate panic. You fit the description of who? David shot back, his tone dropping to a dangerous quiet rumble. Give me the BOLO. Give me the dispatch description. Name the suspect you confused me with. Silence. The computer fans hummed their monotonous tune. You can't, David stated, because there wasn't one. You saw a black man in a windbreaker with a power tool, and your ego wrote a narrative your badge couldn't cash. And when I showed you the receipt, when reality contradicted your prejudice, you chose to escalate rather than admit a mistake. David hit save on the file and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He crossed his arms over his chest. So here is the protocol, David said. You are going to use your radio. You are going to request a patrol supervisor to this location, not a buddy from your shift, a sergeant or a lieutenant. Tell them you have an incident involving a federal agent. Stanton stared at his chest rig where his heavy Motorola radio rested. It looked like it weighed 100 pounds. If he keyed that mic, it was over. It was on the recorded dispatch logs. The private security gig would vanish. Internal Affairs would open a file. Agent, Stanton whispered, tears finally pooling in the corners of his pale eyes. I'm begging you. A heavy knock slammed against the steel fire door, rattling the frame. Both men jumped. Stanton. Hey, Stanton, it's Bradley. A muffled, anxious voice yelled from the hallway. Gary said you locked a guy in here. Open the door, Stanton. Corporate policy says we can't do closed-door detentions without a manager present. David gestured toward the door with a slight tilt of his head. Let your boss in, Stanton. Stanton moved like an old man. He shuffled to the door, his hand shaking as he twisted the deadbolt. He pulled it open just enough to let the store manager squeeze through. Bradley was a thin man in a cheap, poorly tailored grey suit. His name tag was crooked. He smelled intensely of nervous sweat and stale vape smoke. He took one look at the room, at Stanton's pale, weeping face, and then at David, standing tall, calm, and visibly armed with a Glock 19. Bradley froze. The corporate script he had been preparing in the hallway died in his throat. Where are the cuffs? Bradley asked, weakly, looking from Stanton to David. I took them off, David said politely. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his leather bifold, flipping it open to display the gold shield and his federal ID. Special Agent David Vance, IRS Criminal Investigation. Your security guard just illegally detained, assaulted and disarmed a federal officer. Bradley's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled onto a dock. He looked at the gold badge, then at his employee. Stanton, tell me you didn't. Stanton just stared at the floor. Call your supervisor, Officer J. David commanded the patience finally bleeding out of his voice, leaving only cold authority. Now, or my next call is to the FBI field office to report a kidnapping by a local municipal employee. Stanton reached slowly for his radio. His thumb pressed the push-to-talk button. His hand was shaking so badly the static crackled in staccato bursts. Unit 4J, Stanton rasped into the mic. He had to clear his throat and try again. Dispatch Unit 4J. I need a sector sergeant at the hardware store on Route 9. Code 4, but I need a supervisor. Priority. Waiting is the most corrosive element of police work. Action is easy. Adrenaline carries you through it. But the 20 minutes following an adrenaline dump, locked in a room smelling of burnt popcorn and terror, was its own specific kind of purgatory. Nobody spoke. Stanton remained slumped against the edge of the security desk, staring blankly at a stain on the carpet. Bradley, the manager, had retreated to the farthest corner of the tiny room, furiously typing on his phone, undoubtedly drafting a frantic email to Regional Corporate Counsel. David stood near the center of the room. His back ached. His feet hurt. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the harsh, rhythmic grinding of his own molars. He systematically forced his jaw to relax. He ran a mental diagnostic of his body, cataloguing the dull throb in his shoulder and the sharp stinging in his wrists. He didn't want to be doing this. He wanted to be home. He wanted to unlace his boots, open a beer, and watch a mindless documentary about ancient Rome. Instead, he was trapped in this fluorescent nightmare, forced to navigate the treacherous political waters between federal authority and local law enforcement pride. Heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Not the frantic scuffling of the teenager Gary, but the weighted, measured tread of tactical boots and heavy duty belts. The door pushed open. A massive man stepped into the cramped office. He had a thick graying mustache, a high and tight haircut, and 3 gold chevrons pinned to the collar of his uniform. The brass nameplate read Garrett. Behind him, crowding the doorway, was a younger, heavily tattooed patrolman, resting his hand casually on his belt. Sergeant Garrett took one sweeping look at the room. His eyes hit Stanton, registered the physical collapse, then snapped to David. He immediately saw the Glock 19 on David's hip. The atmosphere in the room spiked from tense to lethal in a millisecond. Garrett's hand dropped toward his sidearm, his stance widening. The younger cop in the doorway mirrored the movement. "Hands where I can see them!" Garrett barked his voice, a booming, practiced command designed to shatter resistance. David didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands in surrender, nor did he move them toward his waist. He kept them loosely clasped in front of his chest, perfectly visible, projecting utter calm. "Sergeant Garrett," David said. His voice was loud enough to cut through the tension, but devoid of any aggressive inflection. "My name is David Vance. I am a special agent with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. My credentials are in my left hand." David slowly unclasped his hands, extending his left arm. Pinched between his fingers was the leather bifold already flipped open. Garrett didn't relax his posture. He gestured sharply with his chin to the younger cop. "Check it." The tattooed patrolman stepped into the room, keeping his body bladed, his eyes darting between David's face and the gun on his hip. He snatched the wallet from David's fingers and retreated a step. He angled the ID toward the harsh light of the desk lamp, scrutinizing the holographic seal, the microprinting, the heavy gold shield. "It's good, Sarge," the younger cop said quietly. The aggressive edge instantly vanished from his voice, replaced by a sudden nervous deference. He handed the wallet back to David. Garrett let his hand fall away from his weapon. He let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. He looked at Stanton, who was still staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with his supervisor. "Stanton," Garrett growled. "What the hell is going on here?" I stopped him for a receipt check. Stanton mumbled, his voice thick and broken. "Suspected retail theft." "You arrested a federal agent for shoplifting?" Garrett asked, the disbelief cracking through his professional facade. "He wasn't arrested," David interjected. He stepped forward, forcing Garrett to look at him to deal with him directly. "He illegally detained me. When I informed him I was an armed federal officer, he drew his weapon, physically assaulted me, placed me in handcuffs, and confiscated my duty weapon without clearing the chamber. Garrett closed his eyes. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with a thick, calloused thumb. The headache was forming instantly. The sheer magnitude of the liability in this room was astronomical. "Is this true, Stanton?" Garrett demanded. Stanton finally looked up. He looked destroyed. He wouldn't give me the receipt. He got belligerent. He matched a profile. "Stop talking," Garrett snapped. The command was sharp, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man who was busy tying an anchor to his own legs. Garrett turned his attention fully to David. The blue wall of silence was a real, tangible thing, but Garrett was a 20-year veteran. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. Defending Stanton here meant risking his own pension. "Agent Vance," Garrett said, his tone shifting. It was no longer commanding. It was cautious negotiating. "Are you injured?" David raised his arms, pulling back the cuffs of his windbreaker. The angry, deep red welts encircling his wrists were stark against his dark skin. The skin was broken in 2 places on his right arm, a tiny bead of dried blood clinging to the hair. Garrett winced visibly. "My shoulder is strained from the compliance hold," David said clinically. "My wrists are lacerated. My property was seized. My civil rights were violated in front of a dozen civilian witnesses." "Okay," Garrett said slowly, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Okay, I hear you. We need to document this. We need to get EMS here to look at those wrists." "I don't need EMS," David cut him off. "I need the video footage from the vestibule and this office secured. I need Officer Stanton's body camera footage impounded. And I need the contact information for your Internal Affairs division." Garrett looked at Bradley, the terrified store manager. "You got cameras in that vestibule?" "Yes, sir," Bradley squeaked. "High def, audio too." Garrett looked back at David. The sergeant's face was grim, resigned to the bureaucratic nightmare that was about to unfold. He turned to the younger patrolman by the door. "Escort Officer Stanton to my cruiser." Garrett ordered, his voice dead and hollow. "Relieve him of his duty weapon. Take his badge. He rides in the back." The younger cop didn't say a word. He just reached out his hand, hovering awkwardly near Stanton's elbow, treating the older man like a piece of unexploded ordnance. Stanton's hands went to his duty belt. The heavy tactile sound of thick Velcro ripping apart filled the small room, loud as a gunshot. He unthreaded the black leather basket-weave belt, the weight of the radio, the taser, the spare magazines, pulling it awkwardly toward the floor. He handed it over to the tattooed patrolman. The gold badge came next, unpinned from his chest with trembling fingers. Stripped of the heavy canvas and brass that had projected his authority, Stanton suddenly looked incredibly small. His uniform shirt hung loose over his belly. He didn't look at David. He didn't look at Garrett. He stared at the scuffed toes of his own boots as he shuffled out the door. A hollow, broken man walking to his own bureaucratic execution. When the heavy fire door clicked shut behind them, Garrett let out a long, slow breath through his nose. He rubbed the back of his neck, the skin there thick and red. "Look, Vance." Garrett started the formal agent, dropped in favor of a misguided attempt at cop-to-cop brotherhood. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "The guy's a dinosaur. He's got 2 years to retirement. He got jammed up, made a terrible call. But we police our own. Internal Affairs will chew him to the bone. You don't need to involve the Bureau. You know what a federal civil rights probe does to a department over one idiot's mistake." David looked at Garrett. He looked at the 3 gold stripes on the man's collar. "It wasn't a mistake, Sergeant," David said. His voice was utterly drained, carrying no anger, only the heavy gravitational pull of an undeniable truth. A mistake is writing the wrong statute on a citation. What happened out there was a deliberate choice. He chose who to target. He chose not to read the receipt. He chose to escalate. Garrett shifted his weight, his jaw working silently. He wanted to argue. He wanted to defend the shield. But the red welts on David's wrists were glowing under the sickly green fluorescent light, a physical testament to the undeniable reality of the situation. "I need your business card, Sergeant," David said, extending his hand, "and the case number for the incident report." Garrett hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached into his breast pocket. He handed over a crisp white card with a blue municipal seal. "I'll have dispatch text you the case number before you clear the lot." David didn't offer a handshake. He didn't nod. He simply turned and walked out of the loss prevention office. Bradley, the store manager, was hovering in the hallway, clutching a clipboard to his chest like a ballistic shield. "Sir, please, the store would like to offer—" "I want to leave," David said, walking right past him. He didn't raise his voice. He just kept walking. He found his cart exactly where he had abandoned it in the vestibule. The yellow DeWalt box sat inside, undisturbed. The crowd of onlookers had dispersed, chased away by the arrival of the uniforms. The elderly receipt checker was gone, her folding table abandoned. David grabbed the plastic handle of the cart. Clack-scrape, clack-scrape. The automatic doors hissed open, and the humid, exhaust-choked night air hit him like a physical blow. It smelled of wet asphalt and cooling engines. The sodium vapor lamps bathed the vast parking lot in an ugly, jaundiced orange light. He pushed the cart to his unmarked grey sedan. He popped the trunk, grabbed the heavy yellow box, and threw it inside. It landed with a dull, hollow thud. He slammed the trunk shut, leaving the shopping cart stranded between two white painted lines, and climbed into the driver's seat. He didn't start the engine immediately. He sat in the dark, the faint smell of his own stale morning coffee lingering in the upholstery. The silence of the car was absolute, a stark contrast to the buzzing, chaotic hum of the store. David gripped the steering wheel with both hands. The textured leather was cold against his palms. Then the crash hit. It started in his chest, a tight, vibrating coil of pure, unadulterated stress, unwinding all at once. His hands began to shake. Not a subtle tremor, but a violent, involuntary shuddering that traveled up his forearms. He let go of the wheel, pulling his hands into his lap, but he couldn't stop it. His breathing hitched, coming in short, jagged gasps. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands against his forehead. He had won. He had dismantled the cop, secured the evidence, and asserted his authority. Stanton's career was over. The liability was established. It was a flawless tactical and legal victory. So why did he feel like he was suffocating? Because none of it actually mattered. The gold shield in his pocket was a localized force field. It only worked after the humiliation. It only worked after the assumption of guilt. It didn't stop the heart-stopping terror of the initial grab. It didn't erase the look in the old woman's eyes when she saw him in handcuffs. It didn't change the fundamental, exhausting mathematics of existing in his own skin. He was a GS-13 federal agent, and he had just spent an hour fighting for the right to buy a piece of hardware. The sheer, overwhelming absurdity of the tax he had to pay just to walk out of a store was crushing. David let his head fall back against the headrest. He stared at the beige fabric of the car roof, waiting for the shaking to subside. It took 10 minutes. 10 minutes of sitting in a dark parking lot, breathing in the smell of old coffee, waiting for his nervous system to remember he was safe. When his hands were finally steady enough, he pushed the ignition button. The engine turned over with a smooth, quiet hum. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, a text message from a municipal dispatch number containing a 9-digit case file. He didn't open it. David put the car in gear and drove out of the lot, merging onto the empty night highway. 40 minutes later, he unlocked the front door of his apartment. The old deadbolt stuck, requiring a harsh, practiced jiggle of the key to turn the cylinder. He stepped inside, dropping the heavy yellow drill box onto the entryway rug. The apartment was dark and quiet. He took off his windbreaker, wincing as the fabric dragged across his raw, bruised wrists. He unclipped his holster, securing the Glock in the small biometric safe bolted inside his coat closet. He walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and took out the white cardboard takeout container of pad thai. He didn't bother turning on the microwave. He just grabbed a fork from the drawer, leaned his lower back against the cool laminate of the kitchen counter, and ate the cold noodles in the dark. The food tasted like nothing. David looked down at his wrists. The indentations from the steel cuffs were still there, angry and deep, a physical brand, marking a transaction he never asked to be a part of. He chewed the cold food mechanically, the silence of his apartment ringing in his ears. Tomorrow he would wake up, put on a suit, and seize millions of dollars in illicit assets